May 23rd, 2013, a day I will never forget. And I have to preface the program by saying who I am and what I do. My name is Adrian Brigham, not that that's important, but I'm an entertainment agent, and I work with some famous, what are called legacy acts in the business, and I book concerts for them around the country and work on recording sessions, things like that. And May 23rd, 2013, I was sitting home in my office, and I've got a nice office, and I was, after dinner, and I had a martini, and I was going through a contract with contract writers, which we all hate so much. And I had the TV on, and there was a show, a new show coming on, called Monumental Mysteries. And I like the history, mystery kinds of shows. And Monumental Mysteries is a spin-off of a show you might have seen called Mysteries at the Museum. And so I was kind of half paying attention to it and half reading the contracts. And in their shows, they do like 6 stories an hour. Each story segment lasts about 10 minutes. And the first segment was, I don't know what it was about. The second one was about a guy who climbed a mountain somewhere and had a monument built to him. And this stool is about as high as I'll climb. Other than that, I'm getting airsick. But the third segment came on, and I went crazy for it. And I put down the contract, and I did something I never did, and that's put down my martini as well. And I just became glued to the TV screen. And this is the story I'm going to tell you. It's a true story from World War II. And it starts in Papua New Guinea. And right about where you see the tip of that arrow, there was a grass airfield, one way, that the Army was using, that had been captured from the Japanese. And they were using that to fly reconnaissance missions over Biak Island, which is up here. And the Army was using modified, they were called F-4s, and they were modified P-38s. So this airfield belonged to the 26th Photo Reconnaissance Division. And one afternoon, one of their soldiers was driving his Jeep back from delivering some important messages to another camp. And he was going through the jungle path, dirt road, whatever. And the Jeep sputtered and stalled. And it stranded him out in the middle of the jungle. And the soldier's name was Ed Downing. And Ed he was very frustrated. He got out of the Jeep, he opened the hood, he was fiddling with wires and hitting the carburetor and everything he could do to try to get the Jeep started again. And suddenly he heard a noise off in the undergrowth. He didn't know what it was, but it didn't sound normal. So Ed reached behind the seat of the Jeep, pulled out his rifle, and he walked very softly over to where he heard the noise coming from. And as he peeled apart the bushes, he got very scared because there was a foxhole. And he couldn't see what was in the foxhole, but the noise was coming from it. So he raised his rifle up. He got right up to the edge of the foxhole and lunged forward, ready to shoot. Because there were still stray Japanese on the island. And he got there and he suddenly pulled his rifle down and he said, "A dog, a damn dog." A dog had fallen into the foxhole and was stuck. And Ed didn't like animals, especially dogs. So Ed went back to the Jeep and he fiddled around with the wiring a little bit more. Finally got the Jeep started again. And as he got into the Jeep, ready to drive away, he heard a very sad cry come from the foxhole. And his emotions got the better of him. So he went back, grabbed a blanket from the back of the Jeep, took it out there, pulled the dog out of the foxhole, wrapped the dog in the blanket, put her in the back seat of the Jeep, if you want to call it a back seat, and drove back to camp. And when he got back to camp, he returned the Jeep to the motor pool, which was headed up by a sergeant. And the sergeant just thought it was hysterical that he got stranded in the jungle. And the more that Ed protested and complained about the Jeep, the more the sergeant laughed. And finally, Ed looked at him and he said, fine. He said, if that's the way you want to be, I got a present for you. It's in the back of the Jeep. I hope it craps all over your tent. And Ed walked back to his own tent, which he, and it was, the sergeant's name was Sergeant Beer, by the way. And so he went back to his own tent, which he shared with Private Bill Wynn. And he was trying to clean up, get himself ready for after the day he'd had. And finally, Bill came back in the tent. And Bill was angry. Bill looked at Downey and he said, Ed, he said, what'd you do with that dog? I heard you found a dog in the jungle today. And Ed just looked at Bill and he said, yeah. He said, I gave her to Sergeant Dare. Why? And Ed was like, Bill was like, why didn't you bring that dog and give it to me? You know I love dogs. I've wanted a dog ever since we got here. I love dogs. And they had a few dogs around the camp, but they were all official military dogs. So Ed just looked at Bill and he said, I don't want no mutt in my tent. That's it. So Bill couldn't do much about it, but he thought, well, he'd at least go over to the motor pool and see the dog. So he walked over and he asked Sergeant Dare, he said, where's that dog that Downey found in the jungle today? And Dare pointed at a parachute that lay drying on the ground. And Bill walked over to the parachute and he saw the lump in the parachute. So he peeled it back, and as he peeled the parachute back, suddenly the dog's head popped out. And the dog was like this far away from Bill. And they just stared at each other. And suddenly the dog just leaned forward, licked Bill in the nose. That was it. Bill was smitten. And Bill looked at the sergeant and he said, hey, Sarge, he said, would you sell me this dog? He said, I've got 2 pounds I can give you. And they were dealing in Australian money, so 2 pounds was about $6. And Sergeant Dare said, nah. He said, you know what? She's going to be my good luck charm in the poker game tonight. I'm going to keep her. So that was it. Bill was stuck and nothing he could do. And he went back to his tent and wrote a letter to his fiancée back home in Cleveland and told her what had happened, and that was it. And the next morning, Bill was getting ready to go to his darkroom because, as I said, he was a photographer. And Sergeant Dare stuck his head in the tent and said, hey, Wynn, you still interested in buying that dog? And Wynn looked at Sergeant Dare and he said, why? What's wrong with her? He didn't trust Sergeant Dare. And Sergeant Dare said, well, he said, no, there's nothing wrong with her, but she's not good luck. I said, I lost all my money in the poker game last night. I need some money to get back in tonight's game. So Bill pulled out his wallet, handed Dare the 2 pounds, and put the dog on his bed. And he sat there staring at her. And the black fur on her back reminded him of the smoke that came out of the smokestacks in his hometown of Cleveland. So he decided, I've got to give her a name. I'm going to name her Smoky. And right about that point, Ed came back in the tent. And Ed said, what's that dog doing here? I told you I don't know what in my tent. And Bill looked at Ed and said, I bought her. She's mine. You don't like it, you leave. And Ed backed down then and said, well, fine, just keep her on your side of the tent. And so Bill then had to think, he said, well, I've named her. He said, now I've got to train her. And Bill was an expert animal trainer because he'd grown up during the Depression. And he and his brother and mother made it through the Depression. He had no father. And they were always moving town to town looking for work that his mom could do. And they spent a lot of time in orphanages. So Bill had never really had a lot of human friends. But he'd always had a dog for a best friend and companion. So he'd really become an expert animal trainer. So Bill decided to start to train Smoky. And oh my gosh, was she a smart dog. He discovered very quickly. She learned commands very quickly. And not just ordinary commands. After he got done with the basic obedience, he started teaching her to do some tricks that he thought, well, they could use to showcase or to have fun. They did local, like camp USO type shows. And they would, Smoky became an entertainer at the USO shows. And in all, by the time they got done, Smoky had learned over 200 tricks that she could do. So she was not an ordinary dog by any stretch of the imagination. And she became pretty famous in not only New Guinea, but around the South Pacific because of that. And one evening, Bill was getting ready to go on stage with her to do a few tricks. And he hadn't been feeling well, and he suddenly grew very faint and passed out. And he woke up 3 days later in Nadzab, New Guinea. He had contracted dengue fever. And all I tell people is dengue fever is something you don't want to get any place, anywhere, let alone in a war. So they transferred him to the hospital, and he was there with other soldiers, but he missed his dog. Well, after a day or two of being there, when he was awake, his fellow soldiers from camp showed up, and they brought Smoky with them. And of course, he was thrilled to see his dog, and just as happy as could be. And they also brought this, and we were fortunate enough to have one. This is a copy of Yank magazine from 1944, all hermetically sealed, so I can't even open it up now. But if you go to the inside of the magazine, right in the middle of the magazine, there's a spread, opens up. They had a contest to name the #1 mascot of the South Pacific. And Smoky was named the #1 mascot. And they had a big picture of her right in the middle of the magazine. Kind of a weird picture, but they had a picture of her in the middle of the magazine. And the nurses, seeing how happy she made Bill, thought, well, maybe she could have that effect on the other soldiers in the hospital as well. So she went to the head of the hospital, Dr. Charles, and asked Dr. Charles if they could take Smoky on rounds around the hospital to visit other patients. And they asked Bill, and Bill said it was okay if Dr. Charles okayed it. And they started doing that, and it was a huge success. And Bill will tell you in his own words at the end, it got to the point that they would come and get Smoky at 7 o'clock in the morning and they wouldn't bring her back until 7 o'clock at night. And she was that popular with all of the patients in the hospital. When it came time for Bill to be released, every patient in the hospital, they were all soldiers, they were all begging for passes to go to 10-day passes, basically, to get out of the war. And they weren't giving any out. But Dr. Charles came to Bill and he said, Private Wynn, he said, I'm going to give you a pass, a 10-day pass, but you have to do what I tell you. You have to go take a flight to Australia tomorrow and go find a nurse I know who's the head nurse in Brisbane and do what she says. So Bill figured, yeah, it gets me out of the war for 10 more days, that's fine. So the next day he and Smoky flew to Australia, and he went and found the nurse, and the nurse told him, yes, she said she'd heard about Smoky and all the wonderful things that the dog could do for patients. And she said that she was the head nurse at the Royal Naval Hospital in Brisbane, and she wanted Bill and Smoky to come to the hospital and make rounds. So that is what Bill did. And pretty soon nurses at other hospitals came around and said, could you bring Smoky over by us as well? And before long, Bill spent his entire 10-day pass going from hospital to hospital, room to room even, with Smoky as she performed her really what was called therapeutic work. And it was a program that was picked up by Dr. Charles, who was impressed with it and brought back to this country. And it's a program that today has grown into the therapy dog program. And now Smoky is credited with being the world's first therapy dog of record. And it's a wonderful program. My wife and I have a therapy dog, and it's just amazing to see the effect that these dogs have on people in hospitals, in senior homes. It's a wonderful, wonderful program. And Bill didn't realize it at the time, but Dr. Charles had a name. And here's a picture of Dr. Charles. And he had a very famous last name, but he wasn't so famous at that point in life. But Dr. Charles's last name was male.
Oh my.
And Dr. Charles's father and uncle founded the Mayo Clinic. And so it was pretty special that Smoky got her start really with the Mayo family. Now when Bill returned to his base, the flights over Biak Island had been finished, and they were told to pack up. They were putting their planes, all their gear and everything on board ships because they were going to go north with MacArthur to retake the Philippines. And Bill said it was an exciting but a very warring time at the same rate. He said that on the ships, and the ship he was assigned to was in the second of two convoys that were sailing north for the Philippines. The first convoy was all Army and Marines. The second convoy was more Army and Marines, but all of the backup equipment that would be needed. And they were told when they boarded the ship, when you are attacked, and you will be attacked, go below decks, go to a compartment you're assigned to, seal the door shut on the compartment, which is where they were supposed to sleep at night, and seal the door shut, and that way, in case the ship is hit and floods, only a portion of the ship will flood. And but he said, other than that, it was a pretty boring trip. He said, all they had to do was play cards. They had no television, no radio, no nothing back then. So the guys just spent all day long playing poker, pinochle. But he said one day, he said the sirens went off. And he said the guys dropped their cards. He grabbed Smoky. They ran down the deck. They ran down the stairs and into the compartment that they were assigned to, and they locked the door, sealed it shut. And he said then the guns started. And he said the guns pounding away on deck, and the fact that the compartment was dark, it stunk something awful. He said, and they had no idea what was happening. They were basically sitting ducks. He said it was a very scary time. But finally, the all clear was given. And Bill and Smoky were the first ones out of that door when it opened up. And they ran back up on the stairs, and they ran to the front of the deck. And Bill and Smoky actually hadn't even been sleeping in the compartment because it stunk so bad. They'd made a bed for themselves underneath the Jeep, which was tied down to the front of the ship. But he said he looked around and they couldn't see anything, just smoke way in the distance. There were over 1,000 ships in the convoy. So the guys picked up their cards and started playing cards again. And about 20 minutes went by and the sirens went off again. So again, the guys dropped the cards, they ran back down the deck. But this time Bill and Smoky got there too late, probably on purpose. And they couldn't get in, the door didn't seal shut. So this time, he walked back up the stairs, or probably ran back up the stairs. And just as he got to the top of the stairs, he said suddenly the guns stopped for a minute. Actually, probably just a few seconds. And he said a loud cheer went up. And he ran to the top and he looked around just in time to see an enemy fighter that they had hit spiraling into the sea. So then he made his way back to the bow of the ship as the gun started up again. And he said he didn't realize it, know it at that time, but he said there were over 300 men were killed by that fighter, or by another fighter that came along. And he said that he was standing in the bow of the ship and with Smoky, and he said all of a sudden he saw an enemy plane coming by the front of the ship, so close he could see the pilot's face. And the pilot made a direct hit on another ship off the starboard side. And even then he didn't have enough time to think about it. And this was a picture that Bill actually took. He said suddenly Smoky started to spin and bark, which was something she normally did when she sensed the danger. And so he dove down on the deck really to cover her. And as he did so, there was a loud explosion over his head. And what you can see here in the bottom right corner, that's the front tire of the Jeep where they've been sleeping under at night. Here's the anti-aircraft gun. And right here is an air vent for the lower decks. And that hole right there is what he heard when an enemy shell came in and hit that air vent where he'd been standing. If he hadn't dived down to protect Smoky, he would have been cut in half and killed by that shell. So she really saved his life. And as he got back up, he said he was hurting, but not bloodied up. He said there were other men on the deck that were bloodied from the shrapnel and all. And he said, luckily, that was the only time that their ship came under direct attack in their travels north. And they made it all the way up to the Philippines, and they landed at Luzon, or at Lipsong Bay, which is right there on the northern island of Luzon. And in Luzon Bay, there was a dirt airfield that was been used by the Japanese to launch planes. That airfield is still there today. It's been paved over now. At that time, it was just dirt. But I took this picture off of Google Earth because I want you to see how close the airstrip is to the shore. And that's where they landed, and their job was to make the airfield usable now for flights, reconnaissance flights. And they would now not be using the P-38s anymore. They would now be using PBYs, which were amphibious, either ground or water. And the PBYs were much larger, they could carry much more, they could fly almost 24 hours on a single tank of fuel. And they were slow as could be. But he said it was a little more pleasant to fly in those than it was in the P-38s. And the P-38s could double as search and rescue for pilots that were crashed into the sea. But he didn't think about that. That wasn't his job. His job was photography. And he was getting his dark rooms ready to use. And he said one morning, an officer who was in charge of the communications on their airbase came into his dark room and just started talking. And he didn't know why, but he was just making small talk, and he sat down while Bill was working. And Bill said that he didn't pay much attention to him, except the officer kept staring at Smoky. And finally the officer looked at Bill and he said, "Private," he said, "I'm going to be honest with you, we have a huge problem. We've heard your dog is pretty smart. We're hoping maybe she can help us." When the Army Corps of Engineers laid down and reinforced the runway, because the American planes were much heavier than the Japanese planes, they would sink into the mud and dirt. They had to reinforce the runways with steel grating. And they did so quickly. They didn't take time we needed to run our communication cables out to the beach area where we could contact nearby the Marine bases. And if you're attacked again, we don't have any way of defending ourselves. We need the Marines to come and defend us. And he said, "I'm hoping," he said, "that partway down the runway, there's a tunnel. And we're hoping that it's not big enough for a man to get through, but maybe if we took a string and tied it onto Smoky's collar and got her to crawl through that tunnel, maybe we wouldn't have to dig up the runway. It would take about 300 men and 3 days of time to probably dig that runway up, and all the time they're getting sniped at and stuff." And Bill wasn't too keen on the idea, but knowing the dangers for all the people in his base, he agreed to try. So they tied the string on Smoky's collar, they took her over to the tunnel, and Bill ran to the far side of the runway, and he started to call her to come to him. And he said at first she was scared and she backed out twice. But he said the third time she started to crawl into the tunnel, and hearing his voice, she recognized it. And he said it was all full of dirt and mud. He said she could only walk a short distance before she had to get down and crawl on her all fours. And before long, she just disappeared into the darkness. And he said at that point, the only thing they knew was that the string kept feeding. As long as the string kept feeding through the tunnel, she was safe. But Bill was scared because he'd been in a native camp nearby earlier and seen a python that had eaten a baby pig. And so he was scared because pythons like to live in dark places like that. But he said that she got about halfway through the tunnel and the string stopped moving. And he started just frantically calling Smoky, "Smokes, come to me, come." And finally the string started to move again, and she went another maybe 10 feet and the string stopped moving. And everybody was going crazy. I mean, everybody's got their fingers crossed, they're praying. And he said finally, after the third time of her stopping, he could see the glow of her eyes in the tunnel coming to him. And he said as she got closer, he could see what was happening. He said she was so covered in mud and dirt and trying to crawl through it that all she could do was just pull herself through with her front paws. But finally, she got up with about 5 feet from his end of the tunnel, and there was enough room for her to stand up. And then she suddenly ran forward as quickly as she could and jumped into his arms with the string still attached. And that saved who knows how many lives of men and women that have had to stand there and dig that tunnel up. And it was a long time afterwards, but for that effort alone, Smoky received the War Dog Medal of Honor, which is quite a wonderful thing for her. After that, they made their way north to Okinawa, and Bill's position with his air base now was on this small peninsula here. And Okinawa was where the Navy and the Marines, the Army, was staging for the final invasion of Japan. It was the closest island to Japan. And they knew it was going to be the most dangerous part of the war. The Japanese had vowed to fight every last man, woman, and child. And it was going to be the bloodiest part of the war and most dangerous. And Bill said he was in his darkroom one day, getting ready for the invasion. And he said the Navy had thousands of ships moored all around Okinawa, ready for the invasion. And he said one day he heard a loud cheer go up. And so he poked his head out of his darkroom, and across a space he could see a group of people gathered around the mess hall. And they were looking at a paper that had been posted on the mess hall door. So he went over to see what it was. And this was the picture on the front page of the paper. And it was of the first atomic bomb. And they all hoped and prayed at this point that maybe that would change the Japanese minds and that they wouldn't have to go invade Japan. And it worked. It wasn't too long after that when the second bomb was dropped and the Japanese agreed to surrender. And so Bill and his crew never had to fly reconnaissance over Japan. But he said now it was just a matter of they've got to pack everything up and go back to the States. But that wasn't something you could just do quickly. They built buildings with all their equipment and all. So they were going to be there for a while. And Bill said that one day his commanding officer came to him and said, "Private," he said, "there's a ship leaving tomorrow. And you can be on that ship to Korea, and that's where you will stage for your final trip home to America." And Bill, remembering that pleasure trip up from New Guinea, said, "I don't want to go on a ship again." He said, I'm going to wait until Thursday, and I'm going to catch a plane that's coming through going to Korea. So give my spot to somebody else. So that's what they did. And right after that ship left port in a hurry, Bill said that they were notified that a major typhoon had changed direction and was now headed right straight for Okinawa. And they couldn't do anything about it except just hunker down. And Bill and his new bunkmate, they were out putting rocks and bricks on the top of their little hut, hoping it would hold together through the wind. And he said that night, right after dinner, Typhoon Louise hit. And he said about just maybe half an hour after the storm hit. The winds were so strong it ripped the roof off their hut. And the door opened. And so Bill grabbed his cot, where Smoky was tied to, and he decided to run across a field to another building which was reinforced. And he said he only got a couple steps outside of the building when a gust of wind pulled the cot out of his arms and sent it flying up in the air like a kite, with Smoky still tied to it. And he ran across the field chasing that cot and Smoky. And he said that he finally got a hand on the cot and pulled it back down. And they went into the building, which was reinforced. He said Smoky was banged up, but luckily nothing broke. But he said that the building was reinforced only in its roof. It had no walls, so all the wind and the rain came right through it. And they were there until the typhoon passed. And it turns out that Typhoon Louise was the strongest typhoon ever recorded in the Pacific up till that point. And Typhoon Louise was such a brutal storm. It was a top secret for 10 years after the war ended. The Navy wouldn't admit to it. But Typhoon Louise sank more ships around Okinawa than they had lost in the entire rest of the war combined. And I was giving this talk a few years ago at a facility in Barrington, Illinois, and a man raised his hand and he said, I know I was on one of those ships. He said the typhoon broke my ship in half and we had to swim to shore to survive. And so I can tell you that the next plane that came through, Bill was on that plane. And Bill made it safely to Korea with Smoky, and now they were safe, so we thought. All I had to do was wait for their turn to get on board the ships coming back to America. And at this point, new ranks and awards were being given out. And Smoky had had a coat made for her in Australia when they were there. And it's a very pretty coat. I've seen the coat. It's kind of special. But this is what it looks like. And now Smoky's ranks and medals were sewn onto the coat that she could wear. And when it came time to board the ships coming back, Bill was told that no dog, no animals, no pets of any kind would be allowed on board the ships. There wasn't room for them, there wasn't food for them, and most of all, there was fear that an animal might bring disease on board. Bill would have to leave Smoky in Korea. And that was something he just couldn't bear to do. So together with a couple of his friends, they got the idea of smuggling her on board in an old ammunition crate. And they got her on board the ship. And Bill said that for the first 3 days of the voyage home, he was so seasick he couldn't get out of bed. But the third day out, a first mate came down looking for something else and discovered Smoky. And he was immediately summoned to the captain's quarters, and the officers in charge of the army on board the ship were waiting for him along with the captain. And they read him no riot act. And there were stories going around that they had actually thrown other animals they found overboard. And they were threatening him with all kinds of things, and he would have to sign papers that he was going to pay this huge fine when he got back to the States for bringing his dog on board. And Bill finally agreed. He said, I'll sign anything you want. He didn't have the money, but he told him he did. And he said that they finally let him keep Smoky on board. But when they got back to the States, he was fearing, walking down that plank, that they were going to stop him and demand his thousands of dollars in fines. But he said that actually nobody was there, just the bands playing. They walked down, they went into the cafeteria, they got something to eat, and then they boarded the trains that would take them back to their hometowns. So Smoky and Bill successfully made it back to the States. And they got back to Cleveland, and Bill told his mother and his brother he was coming home. He didn't bother to tell his fiancée. He just went to her house, climbed up on the porch, opened the front door, and pushed Smoky inside, and waited. And he said about 30 seconds went by, and he heard a big scream. And his fiancée came running out and embraced him, and gave him kisses and everything, and that's how they made their trip back home. And they were married not too long after that. Bill didn't have a job, but he conned his best man into driving them to Hollywood, because when Bill was on the ship coming back from overseas, he had met a man who was a professional animal trainer in Hollywood. And the animal trainer was very impressed with Bill and offered him a job there. So they drove Bill's old beat-up Ford to Hollywood, and Bill went to work in the movie studios. And he worked there for about 3 months, and he even trained a dog that Ronald Reagan used in one of Reagan's movies. But he said that after 3 months, his wife was getting very homesick, and she wanted to go home to Cleveland. He said the reason she was getting homesick was because she was pregnant with their first child. So Bill and Smoky and his wife moved back to Cleveland, and there he started a new life. He went to work for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which later on became NASA. And he became an award-winning photographer with the Cleveland Plain Dealer after leaving NASA, or the NACA. And Smoky, well, she went back to doing what she knew best, and that was being an entertainer. And she actually had a television show in the Cleveland area for a couple of years. And Bill said that she once did a series of shows, 40 shows, without ever repeating a single trick. And she was quite popular, to say the least. And Smoky passed away in January of 1957 at the age of 14, but she led quite a life, to say the least. And you look at her list of accomplishments: 12 combat missions, 8 battle stars, 2 presidential unit citations. She is now considered one of the 5 greatest war dogs in U.S. history. The U.S. War Dog Medal of Honor, the first Australian War Dog Medal of Honor, the first official therapy dog of record, and the #1 mascot of the Pacific. That's quite a list of accomplishments for any dog. It's amazing what she did. And she passed on a Saturday night, and the next morning, Bill and his family, which had grown considerably, Bill and his wife actually had 9 children altogether. And they took Smoky in an old ammunition crate to a spot in the Rocky River Reservation. And if you don't know, Cleveland is completely surrounded, U-shaped, by a forest, which is a park. And they took her to a spot on the Rocky River portion, which is on the west side of Cleveland. And there they buried her in a military-style funeral with just his family, in a spot. It was underneath a tree that years earlier, Bill and his, at that time, fiancée, had a picnic and carved her heart. And they figured that that was a place they could always go and see Smoky, visit her grave. because of that spot, regardless of where they lived. And they got home that day, and the story, what do you think would end? But Bill carried on. Bill would continue to go out and tell her story in newspapers, in magazines, lectures and all. And then I saw the story that night when it was part of Monumental Mysteries. And I fell in love with the story. I went absolutely nuts over it. And before the segment even ended, I was on the computer typing and I found Bill's email address and I wrote to him and he wrote me back right away and we became best of friends. And I learned from one of Bill's daughters that Bill had had a long time dream that maybe someday somebody would make a movie out of Smoky's story. It had all the ingredients. Well, real quickly, as I said, I'm a music producer. It so happened that that year we were in the process of making a new album in Chicago, and it was quite an involved process, a year and a half program, $100,000 production, and it made a star out of the singer because it was full orchestra, and it went to the top of the national radio charts, all that kind of thing. And some of the other people that I represented, because then I got invited to Hollywood, and Pat Boone had been playing the music on his radio show, which was part of a radio network. And I went to work helping some of Pat's stars. And I was working with the Cordettes, Ryan DeHughes, who's a real hot young star from Michigan. He's a Sinatra type. This is Dina Martin. We were booking shows for Dina. And my favorite guys, the Four Preps. And the little guy I told you about, Bruce Mellon, was the short guy there in the middle. And of course, Pat himself. And yes, Pat still wears his white buck shoes. But that's how we got involved with the movie project, which is still in process today, because making a movie in Hollywood is not a very easy prospect. But there were people in Cleveland that said, well, gee, you know, Smoky was a great hero. She deserves a monument. She should have one. So it took 35 years, but people got together. They finally collected enough money to build a monument for her, and they needed a place to build it. So they went to the Rocky River Reservation, which is this winding river which goes along the west side of Cleveland. And right about in here is where the Park District cleared a large section of land to make it into a dog park in Smoky's honor. And there they were going to put the monument for her. The only problem was they needed to find her gravesite so they could move her gravesite to the new park and underneath the monument. And they went back to the forest, Bill and his family did, and they walked through the forest for a couple of days looking for this tree with a heart in it to find her gravesite. And they couldn't find it. And finally, one of Bill's daughters mentioned to a park ranger what they were doing, and he just smiled and said, come with me. And he took them to an area of the forest they had gone through, and a tree had fallen down, and they rolled the tree over, and there was the heart. And they found Smoky's gravesite. They moved her gravesite to the new park where the monument was to be. And when they cut that tree out, which they had to do, they cut that section of the tree out, and Bill had that section of the tree in his home. Finally, on Veterans Day of 2005, Bill got up that morning, he put his hat on, his army hat, with all of its medals. He put on a shirt with his medals. And they drove to the safe deposit box where that coat was kept that Smoky wore. He draped it over his arm and they went to the new park. And there they were met by a U.S. Army color guard, people in the media, friends, family certainly, pretty large crowd. And that was the dedication of Smoky's monument. And the color guard played taps for Smoky, and they gave her a 21-gun salute. And it's very lovely what they've done with that area of the park now. I've been there a couple of times. There's a tall flagpole that flies the American flag for Smoky 365 days a year. Over on the left, there is a plaque next to the monument. And that plaque shows the 5 greatest war dogs in U.S. history. And there's seating there, and there's another boulder over on the side with a plaque to commemorate all of our veterans. And it's very nice what they've done with it. But if you go there and see the monument, I will tell you that it might be surprised by it, because the monument stands about so high. It's marble block, weighs I think 3 tons, and it has inscriptions on 2 sides of it. And on top of the monument there is a statue of Smoky. And the statue is a little weird because it's taken from the picture that was in Yank magazine. And you would expect a statue of a dog that was a great hero to look something like one of these. Perhaps sitting at attention, or standing at attention, or running or leaping, something a hero dog might expect them to do. But I'll tell you that that's not what the statue looks like. As I've been telling you the story, I've told you a lot about Smoky, but I haven't showed you any pictures of him. So you've had to create an image in your mind as to what Smoky looked like. And most people would think of Smoky as probably a German Shepherd, because Shepherds are the biggest and strongest, the most intelligent, the best dogs you could ever want for use in war. They're strong and courageous. And if that's the image you created for yourself of Smoky, I would understand that. But you'd be quite wrong. Because Smoky, honey, I can show you what Smoky looked like.
This was what Smoky looked like?
Smoky was actually a 4-pound Yorkshire Terrier.
No.
And who would have ever thought that a little dog like that could do all those great things and be so courageous? But she was. And it says on the front of the monument, it's called Yorkie Doodle Dandy, and it lists some of her awards and all. And that's what she looked like. And there's the monument. And Smoky's origin, well, I can tell you that at this point. What we think. She was obviously found in a foxhole in New Guinea, in the jungle. But a friend of mine, they call him my counterpart in Australia, did research on it. And when Bill got home that day, after burying Smoky the first time, the phone rang and a woman said she'd read the obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer about her. And she said, "You don't know who I am, but Smoky was my dog." And Bill was like, "What?" And she went on to say that she had been a nurse in Australia and then in New Guinea. And her fiance had bought her a puppy he found for sale in the front window of a pharmacy. And she named the dog Christmas. They went to a Joe E. Brown concert in New Guinea. The dog got away from them and they never found the dog again. And they think what happened was a soldier picked the dog up, some stray soldier, tried to take it home with him. She got out of his Jeep, ran into the jungle, and luckily was found by Ed Downey. But the question was, well, how could a dog, especially a little dog like this, how could a dog like this even get to Australia? Because Yorkshire Terriers were so rare. There were only 4 known to exist in Australia at that time. And they were so expensive, the average Australian could never afford one. So the fact that one was for sale in the front window of the pharmacy had to tell you it had some special beginnings. And my friend Nigel in Australia found a man or a woman who had gone to school, private school with a young boy whose parents had a Yorkshire Terrier and it had a puppy and was being kept for sale in the front window of the pharmacy. So you got to figure, well, that's where the puppy came from. And who was that boy's parents that could afford a Yorkshire Terrier? Well, we have a picture of the boy, we know that much about him. That's what he looked like. And his parents were the MacArthurs, General Douglas MacArthur and his wife. So we can't prove it, but we have reason to believe that Smoky was actually the puppy of the MacArthur's dog. And December 11th of 2015, my wife and I went to Cleveland for, I think it was the second time, whatever. We went there because there was a special award being given out that day, and that's us with Bill. And he was receiving the Australian RSPCA Cross for her service. And it was a pretty neat event, to say the least. This is what the medal looks like. And this is a picture now of a number of her medals that she earned in front of her monument. And I will finish up by, here's Bill and Corporal Smoky. I'm going to finish up by running a short 4-minute video of Bill telling you in his own words about Smoky.
Yeah, I bet it did.
was Smoky, her rank was corporal, and her serial number? Well, let's just say during World War II, she was quite the canine. As you can see, Smoky had quite a few tricks up her sleeve. Tricks that her trainer Bill Wynn says gave hope to dozens of wounded World War II soldiers.
She was the first therapy dog on record. We were in Nadzab, New Guinea, and I was in the hospital with dengue fever. They were bringing wounded off of the Biak Island invasion. So the fellows brought Smoky to see me at the hospital, and they brought a copy of Yank magazine where she just appeared as the best mascot in the South Pacific. So the nurses saw this Yank magazine and they saw this little dog, and they said to me, would you let Smoky go on rounds if we can get permission from our commanding officer to have her? And I said yes. 7 o'clock in the morning they came. She was gone all day till 9 o'clock at night. I don't know, they fed her, whatever she had to do, they took care of her. So I would like, in retrospect, have been with them just a few times to see how these guys reacted, because these are wounded, they're coming off of combat. Here's this little dog that's going through the war with them. I think that Smoky being there kind of turned things around a little bit, because she'd been a dog in the war with them, and she was novel in her size and what she was doing. They'd hear her story and they'd watch her perform, and so it really had a whole different effect than your average therapy dog would, because you're dealing directly with the realities of life as it is going to be, and that's a very steep change for people.
Many times, the response to Smoky turned into heated debates among patients.
I was in Australia, and they were arguing over who's going to take her in the wheelchair to the next ward. They were wheeling around, going from ward to ward with me to hear the talk again and again, and each one wanted to carry the dog when they were going between wards.
And sometimes Smoky's effect was more profound than anyone could imagine.
They put me in the day room, and they had people coming in to hear my talk and show performance, so they could get the people I didn't go around to wards to. And they put a man in a wheelchair right up front. So as I started to talk and Smoky started to do a few things, he started to gurgle, this man did. One of the nurses right away said, Mr. Wynn, just stop a minute, give him the dog, give him the dog. So we handed her the dog, handed him the dog, and he started, he held her up in the air, and he was gurgling and making all of these sounds and everything. He was just so thrilled. And I looked, and all the nurses were crying. And I wondered what the heck's wrong, you know. And he hadn't talked for 2 years, showed no emotion, he had hardly moved. And yet when he got a hold of the dog, that was his response.
In her time, Smoky did her share of helping soldiers, and today she is immortalized in a display at the University of Tennessee College of Veterinary Medicine.
The story is so unusual, this little tiny creature doing so much. However, the size didn't mean anything, because the ability of the dog to withstand all the rigors of it was amazing. 4 pounds of dog in warfare is pretty remarkable. And again, we lived it day to day and didn't think that much of it. Her story has become legendary. She was a legend in her own time. The stories start coming out of the far Pacific about this little dog. She appeared in the New York Herald Tribune, where we were waiting for the war to end. She had a lot of spunk, and she showed it in a lot of ways.
And that's in Bill's own words. I put the circle up on the picture there. People always ask me if Smoky ever had any puppies, and she did. She had a puppy. Bill was on an assignment, and he left her with another friend of his in camp for a week. And when he came back, he didn't think about it, but it was, I don't know what the gestation period is, but he said that couple months later, he said she was running across the field and this little black thing fell out of her back, and it was a puppy. And the puppy survived and lasted 9 months, and then a disease swept through camp and killed all the dogs except Smoky and 1 or 2 others. But Harry is not a direct descendant of Smoky, just so you know. He looks just like her and he's the same size, but he's not a direct descendant. I will tell you also that, as I forgot to mention it, that album that we were working on, Hotel Lafayette, was pretty major production, but it was in the Grammys and all kinds of neat stuff and all that. But the star that album created was my very lovely wife, Denise. So that was her album. It was number 1 in national airplay. And I have something here to show you. And actually, I'm gonna, yeah, got that. I'm gonna turn this off because it's blinding me. One day, 10 years ago or more, I guess, a very heavy box arrived from Bill and his wife, Marcia. Well, his wife had passed on, but Bill and his family. And the statue of Smoky in Cleveland, it was created by Susan Bahari, who's a very famous sculptor. Yeah, I couldn't think of the word. And Susan is famous for doing animal sculptures, and she's done them all over the world, and a lot of them in Washington are by her. And she created the statue, 30 of them. 20 of them in bronze, or I'm sorry, 20 of them in resin for indoor use in museums, and 10 of them in bronze for use outdoors. And they're all gone now, they're all been used up. But that heavy box was one of the statues. And so I have here, in fact, honey, you wanna bring Harry over here? Our little guy's name, by the way, is Harry Potter. But we have, this is the actual statue of Smoky. And this was the picture that appeared in the magazine. And this is how Bill used to give Smoky her bath. And she got a daily bath because they were in the jungle with a lot of parasites. So she would sit in his helmet and get her bath. And now you see Harry is doing the same thing there. So that's how small they were. He's like, you took out the blanket, so I'm cold. Yeah, I don't think that there's usually a blanket right in the bottom, and he's like, I'm cold here, Mom. But anyhow, well, that is Smoky's story. We hope you enjoyed it. And Harry is a trained therapy dog. He's with the Alliance of Therapy Dogs. So he's very well trained. You are most welcome to come and pet him and say hi to him and whatever. He won't bite. He's a sweetheart.
So does Harry go around to hospitals?
Oh, yes.
Yes?
Oh,
Oh,
yes.
good.
Yes. Hospitals, hospice centers, children's hospitals,
Oh, wow.
nursing homes.
And I didn't have it in the slides here, but he's quite famous for his costumes, because when he goes out to visit in the children in hospitals or people in senior homes, he rides in one of his costumes, and he's got 22 different vehicles he rides in. He's a fireman, and he's a Cubs player, and he was the ring bearer at our daughter's wedding in his Mercedes. So he's won over 100 pet costume contests, but he's just a little sweetheart. People love him so much, so he's carrying on very well in Smoky's honor. So, any questions that anybody's got that I can answer? You see, I got to be very good friends with Bill, and he was a sweetheart. I miss him very much, but he lived to be 99 years old. He had a pretty good life, and I still talk to his family pretty often. So we're hoping that someday we can get a movie made. That's a story in and of itself, to say the least. Spent a lot of time in Hollywood running around, from lawyer to directors, producers, and we're back to square one now. But anyway, well, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.